Deep in the Carpathian Mountains, 30,000 years ago, Kael tracked elk through the morning mist when he heard something that shouldn't exist, crying that sounded almost human but wrong. Following the sound to a ravine, he found her, a stranger unlike any he'd seen, her skin pale as winter snow, her wounds sealed with some unknown craft that left no scars. But Kael wasn't just any hunter. Cast out as a child for asking dangerous questions, he'd learned to see patterns others missed, to think beyond the tribe's sacred traditions. And this stranger spoke in whispers of metal birds in the sky, of great waters rising, of his people's future written in the stars. The tribal elders demanded her death. She was unnatural, they said, a curse that would bring the ice spirit's wrath. Yet when she showed Kael images painted in colored dirt, images of floods and fires that matched his own forbidden visions, he realized she might be their only chance at survival. But accepting her gift would mean betraying everything his tribe believed. Could one decision really change the course of human history? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The elk's tracks led down toward the frozen stream where thin ice crackled under Kael's careful steps. He'd been following the trail since before dawn, hoping to bring fresh meat to a tribe that grew hungrier each day as the eternal winter tightened its grip. The crying had stopped him mid-stride, his obsidian spear raised, every instinct screaming danger. She lay curled against the ravine's base, her strange coverings torn, but somehow still protecting her from the killing cold. Her hair fell in waves the color of fresh copper, nothing like the dark manes of his people. When she stirred at his approach, her eyes opened to reveal an impossible blue, like the sky on those rare days when the clouds parted. "What are you?" he asked. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't catch. Then stronger, "I am like you. Human, but from—" she struggled, pressing a hand to her temple. "From the time that comes." Kael's scarred fingers tightened on his spear shaft. The scars came from his 7th winter, when he'd asked Elder Brack why the stars moved in patterns and been answered with a burning brand pressed to his knuckles. Questions were dangerous things in their tribe, seeds that grew into doubt about the ancestors' wisdom. But questions had also taught him to read weather in cloud formations others ignored, to find game trails where others saw only wilderness. Questions had kept him alive when other hunters failed to return from the ice. "Show me," he said. She reached into her torn coverings and withdrew a handful of colored earth, ochre and charcoal, and something white as bone dust. With trembling fingers, she began to paint on the dark stone beside her. The first image showed water rushing over land, carrying away trees and animals and the hide shelters of human settlements. The second showed flames reaching toward the sky, consuming forests in waves of orange and red. Kael's breath caught. These matched the dreams that had plagued him for seasons, visions that came in the deep of night when the fire burned low. Dreams of his people scattered like leaves before storms they couldn't understand or survive. "The ice comes first," she whispered, adding white streaks to her paintings. "Then it retreats. The waters rise, the earth shakes. Your people, our people, they can survive, but only if they learn to see beyond the next hunt, the next winter." "The elders say the ice is eternal," Kael said. "That questioning the ancestors' ways brings curse and death." The ancestors were wise for their time, her blue eyes fixed on his. "But their time ends. Yours begins. The choice comes to you, Kael, of the sharp questions." He started. He'd never told her his name or the mocking title the other hunters had given him, yet she spoke as if she'd known him for years instead of heartbeats. Footsteps crunched through the snow above. Other voices carried on the wind, Jorik and Thane tracking him as he tracked the elk. Soon they would find this place, find her. Soon the choice she spoke of would arrive whether he was ready or not. "What choice?" he asked. She pressed something into his palm, a small object that felt warm despite the cold, smooth as river stone but perfectly round. To listen, she said, or to let fear decide your people's fate. The stranger's fever broke just as the first pale light touched the horizon. Kael had spent the night beside the fire, watching the rise and fall of the wounded man's chest, periodically checking the crude bandages he'd fashioned from strips of his own tunic. The bleeding had stopped, but the wounds themselves defied explanation, perfectly straight lines that seemed almost deliberate, as if carved by some impossibly sharp tool. When the stranger's eyes finally opened, they were the color of storm clouds, gray and shifting. He tried to sit up, winced, then fell back against the moss Kael had gathered for a pillow. His gaze found Kael immediately, studying him with an intensity that made the hunter's skin prickle. "Water," the stranger whispered, his voice carrying that same strange accent that seemed to reshape familiar words. Kael handed him a water skin, watching as the man drank with careful, measured sips. Everything about him spoke of discipline, control, even weakened as he was. "You saved my life," the stranger said, returning the water skin. "Thank you. What happened to you?" Kael asked. "Those wounds, I've never seen anything like them." "Marcus," the stranger replied, then seemed to catch himself. He paused, as if translating. "Markesh. My name is Markesh." Another lie, Kael suspected, but he nodded as if accepting it. "Can you travel? My village is half a day's walk. Our healer could tend your wounds properly." "No." The response came too quickly, too sharp. Marcus, or Markesh, caught Kael's expression and softened his tone. "I cannot impose further on your kindness. And there are others who might be hunting me." "Hunting you? Dangerous people. If they found me in your village, it would bring death to innocent lives." The words carried weight, genuine concern that didn't match with the lies he'd been telling. Kael found himself caught between suspicion and sympathy. "What did you do?" Marcus stared into the dying embers of the fire. "I learned something I wasn't supposed to know, something about the way the world really works." Before Kael could ask what that meant, a sound drifted through the forest, distant but unmistakable. Voices calling out in some harsh, unfamiliar language. Marcus went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to his side where a weapon might hang. "They found me," he breathed. Kael's hunting instincts kicked in. The voices were coming from the east, perhaps a quarter-mile away, moving methodically like trackers following a trail. "Who are they?" "People who would kill us both rather than let me escape." Marcus struggled to sit up, his face pale with effort. "You have to go. Now. Forget you ever saw me." But Kael was already moving, gathering their few supplies and kicking dirt over the fire. "Can you walk? I told you to leave." "Can you walk?" Kael repeated firmly. Marcus tested his legs, grimacing as he rose. "Yes, but not far." "Then we move smart, not fast." Kael shouldered his pack and bow. "There's a stream 100 paces north. We'll follow it downstream. The water will mask our scent and muffle our footsteps." As they made their careful way through the underbrush, the voices grew clearer. Kael caught fragments of words that meant nothing to him, but their tones spoke of professional determination. These weren't bandits or raiders. They were something else entirely. The stream was ice-cold and knee-deep, fed by mountain snowmelt. Marcus gasped as they entered the water, but he didn't complain. They moved downstream in silence, stepping carefully on the smooth stones of the streambed. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Kael led them up onto the opposite bank. The voices had faded, but he knew better than to assume they were safe. He'd once tracked a wounded elk for 2 days, through terrain twice as challenging as this. "There's a cave system about a mile from here," he whispered. "We can rest there, treat your wounds properly." Marcus nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me. I could be exactly what they say I am." Kael paused, considering the question. "Maybe, but I've seen how you move, how you think. You're not a killer." He met Marcus's storm-grey eyes. Besides, anyone those people want dead badly enough to track through the thornwood, well, that makes you interesting. Something like a smile flickered across Marcus's face. Interesting. Yes, I suppose that's one word for it. His expression grew serious again. But Kael, before this goes any further, there are things you need to understand. Things about your world that aren't what they seem. Such as? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, listening to the forest around them. Such as the fact that this isn't really your world at all. The quantum field is destabilizing, the stranger mumbled, his eyes unfocused and distant. We have to evacuate the colony before the cascade failure reaches the outer settlements. Kael pressed a damp cloth to the man's burning forehead, trying to soothe him back to sleep. But the stranger's grip suddenly tightened on his wrist with surprising strength. Listen to me, the man said, his gaze suddenly sharp and urgent. Your people, they're in danger. The seismic readings show massive instability beneath this region. You have to move them to higher ground before... His words dissolved into incoherent rambling about numbers and measurements that held no meaning for Kael. Yet something in the stranger's tone, the desperate certainty in his voice, sent ice through the hunter's veins. As dawn painted the sky purple and gold, Kael ventured outside to check his snares. The familiar ritual of hunting usually calmed his mind, but today his thoughts churned like storm clouds. The stranger's ravings echoed in his memory, particularly the urgent warning about danger to his people. "How long have I been here?" the man asked, his voice hoarse but clear. 3 days, Kael replied, settling beside the small fire he kept burning near the cave entrance. "You were badly hurt, burned. I found you in the forest near metal wreckage that fell from the sky." The stranger's face darkened with what looked like grief. "The others? Were there others with me?" Kael shook his head. "Only you. And pieces of something that looked like no tool or weapon I've ever seen." For a long moment, the stranger stared at the cave ceiling, and Kael saw tears track down his weathered cheeks. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of terrible loss. "My name is Dr. Marcus Chen. I'm part of a research expedition from..." He paused, seeming to wrestle with how to explain. "From a settlement far to the north. We came here to study the geological formations in this region because our instruments detected something dangerous." "What kind of dangerous?" Kael asked, remembering the morning's tremor. Marcus struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wounds. "The ground beneath this entire area is unstable. There's a massive fault line running directly under where your people live. Our data shows it's building toward a catastrophic shift that will devastate everything for hundreds of miles." Kael frowned. "The Earth has always moved sometimes. My people have lived here for countless generations. We know how to read the land's moods." "Not like this," Marcus said urgently. "This isn't just seasonal shifting. The geological pressure has been building for decades, maybe centuries. When it releases..." He gestured helplessly, as if trying to convey something beyond the reach of words. "Entire mountains will fall. The rivers will change course. Nothing will survive." The conviction in Marcus's voice was unsettling, but Kael had learned caution from years of hunting. "How do you know this? What instruments could tell you such things?" Marcus studied him for a long moment, and Kael sensed the man reaching some internal decision. "Show me the metal pieces you found with me. What's left of our equipment might still contain the data we gathered." Kael hesitated. Something deep in his hunter's instincts warned him that retrieving those strange artifacts would change everything. Once he brought them into this sacred cave where his ancestors had sheltered, there would be no returning to the simple certainty of his old life. But as if summoned by his thoughts, another tremor shook the ground beneath them. This one lasted longer than the first, strong enough to rattle loose stones from the cave walls. Marcus gripped Kael's arm with desperate intensity. "Please," the stranger whispered. "If I'm right, your people have perhaps days or weeks before this mountain tears itself apart. I need that equipment to know for certain." Kael stared into Marcus's eyes and saw not madness or deception, but the terrible clarity of someone who had witnessed devastation beyond imagining. Outside, the forest had fallen into an unnatural silence, as if the very trees were holding their breath. The choice stretched before him like a chasm he could not cross twice. The stranger's fever broke on the third night, but with consciousness came delirium that chilled Kael's blood. She spoke in languages he'd never heard, her voice shifting between the melodic tones of his own people and harsh, clipped sounds that seemed to scrape against the air itself. Sometimes she would sit bolt upright, eyes wide but unseeing, and speak of things that made no sense, metal birds that soared without wings, rivers of light that flowed through the darkness, and great floating cities that had fallen from the sky like dying stars. Kael found himself drawn to these fevered ravings despite their strangeness. There was a consistency to her madness, a structure that suggested these weren't mere phantoms of illness, but fragments of memory struggling to surface. When she spoke of the great burning, her hands would trace patterns in the air, complex geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. The cave's shadows seemed to shift and dance in response, as if her very presence was bending the natural order. On the fourth morning, she opened her eyes and truly saw him for the first time. Her gaze was sharp and assessing, taking in every detail of his face, his clothing, the crude stone tools at his belt. When she tried to speak, only a harsh croak emerged. Kael brought water to her lips, noting how she drank with careful, measured sips rather than the desperate gulping he'd expected. "Where am I?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The question came in his language, but her accent was unlike anything from the known tribes. "Safe," Kael replied, settling back on his heels. "You were dying when I found you. That was 4 days past." She attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounds. 4 days. Her eyes grew distant, calculating. "Then they may have already—" She stopped abruptly, studying his face with new intensity. "What tribe are you?" "I am Kael, son of Thoric, hunter of the Riverstone people." He kept his voice neutral, though questions burned in his throat. "And you are far from any territory I know." "The Riverstone people," she repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "How many winters since the great ships fell silent?" The question made no sense, but something in her tone suggested it was crucial. "I don't understand." "What ships?" A look of profound sadness crossed her features. Of course, the knowledge would be lost by now. She struggled to a sitting position, her movements careful but determined. "Tell me, hunter of the Riverstone, do you know the stories of the time before, when your people first came to these lands?" Kael frowned. The old tales spoke of migration, of following the herds across vast distances, but they were children's stories, weren't they? The elders say we came from the eastern wastes, but that was generations past. Before memory. "Not before memory," she said quietly. "Before records. Before the means to keep memory alive." She touched her wounded shoulder gingerly, then met his eyes again. "My name is Zara, and I am what your people once were, before the world changed." The words sent an inexplicable chill down Kael's spine. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, the sound of voices echoed from outside the cave. Kael's blood turned to ice as he recognized his father's voice among them. He pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for Zara to remain silent, then crept to the cave entrance. Through the narrow opening, he could see a search party picking their way across the rocky slope below. His father led them, along with 3 other hunters, and, to Kael's dismay, old Harik. The shaman's presence meant this wasn't just concern for a missing hunter. They were looking for something specific. "The signs are fresh," Harik was saying, his gnarled fingers tracing marks on a boulder. "He was here, and recently. But there's something else." The old man's voice trailed off as he examined the ground more closely. "Strange. The spirit's whisper of otherness, of things that should not be." Kael's father, Thoric, paused in his climb. "Speak plainly, shaman. Is my son in danger?" All are in danger when the old boundaries are crossed, Herrick replied cryptically. He lifted his staff, its bone chimes rattling in the wind. I feel echoes here, shadows of what was lost. Your son has found something, or something has found him. The hunters exchanged uneasy glances. Thoric's jaw tightened with frustration and worry. Then we search every cave, every crevice. Kael! His voice boomed across the rocks. If you can hear me, answer. Whatever trouble you're in, we'll face it together. Kael felt Zara's hand on his shoulder. She had moved silently to join him at the cave mouth, her earlier weakness seemingly forgotten. They won't understand, she whispered urgently. If they find me, they'll kill me as a demon or worse. But you need to know what I carry, what I remember. Your people will need it soon. The signs are already beginning. What signs? The wrongness in the weather, animals fleeing south, the way shadows fall differently than they should. Her grip on his shoulder tightened. The world is about to change again, Kael, and this time forgetting won't save anyone. The stranger's fever broke just before dawn, but Kael found no relief in watching the ragged breathing finally settle into something resembling peaceful sleep. 3 days had passed since he'd carried the wounded man to this hidden cave. 3 days of lies told to his hunting party about tracking elk deeper into the forbidden territories. Soon someone would come looking. He studied the pale face in the dim firelight, noting how the features seemed both foreign and strangely familiar. The stranger's hair held an odd sheen, almost metallic in certain light, and his skin bore faint markings that weren't quite scars, geometric patterns that seemed to shift when Kael wasn't looking directly at them. The impossible weapon lay wrapped in hide beside the sleeping figure. Kael had examined it countless times, running his fingers along its smooth surface, searching for joints or mechanisms that might explain how it worked. The material felt neither wood nor stone nor metal, yet somehow all three. When he pressed what appeared to be a simple depression near the handle, the device hummed with barely contained energy that made his teeth ache. You shouldn't touch that without proper neural interfacing. Kael jerked his hand back, startled to find pale eyes watching him with sharp intelligence. The stranger struggled to sit up, wincing as movement pulled at his bandaged wounds. You're awake. Kael reached for a water skin. Drink slowly. You've been fevered for days. The stranger accepted the water gratefully, though his gaze never left Kael's face. You saved me. Why? You were dying. That's not an answer. Your people, they would have left me for the scavengers, yes? Or killed me themselves for trespassing on sacred ground. Kael felt ice form in his stomach. How do you know about the sacred territories? A bitter smile crossed the stranger's lips. Because I know this place better than you realize. My name is Arn, and I was one of the keepers of the archives, though I suppose that means nothing to you. The what? Arn gestured weakly toward his weapon. The device you've been studying. It's a fragment of your ancestors' technology, passed down through generations of my order. We were tasked with protecting the old knowledge until it was time. Time for what? To return it to those it rightfully belongs to. Arn's eyes bored into Kael's. To your people. To you. Kael shook his head, backing away. My people are hunters. We follow the herds, honor the spirits, keep the old ways. We're not advanced? Technological? Arn laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Your old ways aren't as old as you think, Hunter. 300 years ago, your ancestors lived in cities that touched the sky. They sailed between stars as easily as you track deer through forest. The words hit Kael like physical blows. You're fever-mad, talking nonsense. Am I? Arn struggled to his feet, swaying but determined. Tell me, in your deepest sacred places, have you never seen stones that glow without fire? Metal beams too straight and perfect for any smith? Chambers that echo with voices when no one speaks? Kael's mouth went dry. The heart of the mountain, the most sacred site of his people, contained exactly such wonders. The elders called them gifts from the spirits, proof of their divine favor. But if this stranger spoke truth, Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why would we forget? Why would we choose to live like animals? Arn finished gently. Because the alternative was extinction. The Great War, the burning of worlds, the collapse of everything your people had built across 1,000 systems. The survivors who fled here made a choice: abandon technology, scatter into small tribes, become invisible, hope their enemies would forget about one small primitive world on the galactic rim. But they're coming back, aren't they? Kael felt the truth of it settle into his bones like winter cold. Your enemies. That's why you're here. Arn nodded slowly. The hegemony has found you. Their scouts arrived 6 months ago. I tried to warn the other keeper settlements, but... He touched his bandaged side. The advanced forces are already in system. You have perhaps days before the first landing. To do what? Remember who you really are. The archives contain genetic locks keyed to bloodlines like yours, direct descendants of the original settlers. With your help, we can awaken the sleeping defenses, restore enough technology to fight back. Kael stared at the weapon, imagining it in his own hands, imagining weapons like it in the hands of his people. And if we refuse, if we choose to remain as we are, then the hegemony will strip mine this world for resources and add your people to their slave colonies, just like they did to the Kepler worlds and the Centauri settlements. Arn's voice carried the weight of witnessed atrocity. Primitive worlds don't last long once they're discovered. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. Outside, Kael could hear the first birds of morning beginning their songs, innocent and unaware that their world balanced on the edge of transformation or annihilation. Everything he'd ever known was about to change. Water, the stranger whispered, voice hoarse but steady. Kael offered the gourd, watching as pale hands, softer than any he'd ever seen, grasped it with surprising strength. The stranger drank deeply, water trickling down a chin unmarked by ritual scars. Thank you. The words were spoken in the old tongue, the ceremonial language known only to the shamans and elders, yet the accent was wrong, the inflection strange, as if speaking words learned from ancient texts rather than living breath. Who are you? Kael asked, settling back on his heels. The stranger's gaze swept the cave, taking in every detail with an intensity that made Kael's skin crawl. Those eyes seemed to catalogue and memorize everything, the arrangement of his hunting tools, the way smoke drifted toward the ceiling, the patterns of light filtering through the entrance. My name is... The stranger paused, as if choosing carefully. Zara, and I am not from your lands. The northern tribes speak differently, but still use words I know. You speak our sacred language, yet you are clearly not of the shaman's bloodline. Kael leaned forward. Where do you come from? Zara struggled to sit upright, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounds. Kael instinctively moved to help, then stopped himself. Something in her manner, the way she observed him, felt calculating. If I tell you the truth, Zara said slowly, you will either think me mad or cursed, perhaps both. I have seen you heal from wounds that should have killed you. I have watched your flesh knit itself together in ways that defy nature. Perhaps madness would be a relief. A bitter smile crossed Zara's features. I come from a time that has not yet arrived, from days your great-great-grandchildren might live to see if they are fortunate. Kael's hand moved instinctively to his spear. You speak in riddles. No riddles. Truth. Zara's voice grew stronger. I come from a future where your people no longer exist, where the great hunts are legends, where the old ways are forgotten stories, where the lands you know have been carved and changed beyond recognition. The words hit Kael like physical blows. Impossible. Your tribe will face a choice within the next moon cycle. A great sickness approaches from the east, a plague that will claim half your people if they remain in the traditional winter grounds. But if you convince them to move to the high valleys, they will survive. More than survive, they will prosper. Kael stood abruptly, pacing to the cave mouth. If what you claim is true, if you truly come from times yet to be, Then you would know things. Prove it. Tomorrow, your hunting party will find the great elk herd in the canyon of 3 stones, but Jorik will fall from his horse and break his shoulder. The injury will seem minor, but corruption will set in. Without proper care, he will die within 7 days. The blood drained from Kael's face. The hunting party was indeed planned for tomorrow, and Jorik was to lead it. You could be guessing. The corruption can be prevented if you clean the wound with the silver moss that grows on the north face of the canyon walls, then bind it with cloth that has been boiled in water mixed with the bitter root your healers use for stomach ailments. These were not the treatments his people used. Their healing ways relied on poultices and ritual cleansing, yet something in Zara's certainty made him listen. And the sickness you speak of? It spreads through water. Your winter camp draws from streams that feed into the great river, but the high valleys have springs that flow from deep rock, clean water, safe water. Kael turned back to study her face. No deception flickered in those strange eyes, only a desperate earnestness that shook him to his core. Why do you tell me this? If you truly come from days ahead, why do you care what befalls us? For the first time, Zara's composure cracked. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Because in my time, I learned that your people were the last to remember, the last to know the old ways of reading the land, of understanding the patterns that keep the world in balance. When your tribe disappeared, knowledge died with them, knowledge that could have prevented so much destruction. And you would save us? I would try, though it may cost me everything. She met his gaze directly. The question is whether you will help me, or whether you will choose the comfort of familiar paths that lead only to ending. Outside the cave, morning birds began their calls, and Kael could hear the distant sounds of his village stirring to life. Soon they would miss him. Soon choices would need to be made. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping spirits as Kael crept through the underbrush, his spear steady in his grip. 3 days had passed since the stranger's demonstration with the fire stick, and the memory burned in his mind more fiercely than any flame. The way the distant tree had simply exploded. The casual manner in which Zara had wielded such devastating power, as if it were no more remarkable than casting a stone. Now, as he tracked the deer whose prints marked the soft earth, Kael found his thoughts wandering to forbidden places. What other wonders did Zara possess? What other impossible things could she teach him? The deer emerged from behind a cluster of thorn bushes, its head raised, nostrils flaring as it tested the wind. Kael drew back his arm, muscles coiled with practiced tension. In that moment of perfect stillness before the strike, a sound shattered the morning quiet, a deep, resonant howl that seemed to come from the earth itself. The deer bolted. Kael's spear flew wide, embedding itself in the trunk of an oak. But the missed hunt was forgotten as that otherworldly cry echoed across the valley again, longer this time, filled with a hunger that made his bones ache. Smoke rose from the settlement as he crested the ridge, not the gentle smoke of cooking fires, but the thick black smoke of burning homes. Below, chaos reigned. Massive shapes moved through the village like living shadows, their forms shifting and uncertain, as if they were made of darkness given substance. Where they passed, the very air seemed to dim. Warriors lay scattered in the dirt, their weapons useless against creatures that seemed to absorb their strikes. Kael watched in horror as Jorik, the tribe's greatest hunter, swung his war axe through one of the beasts, only to have it pass harmlessly through its body as if cutting smoke. The creature turned, revealing eyes like cold stars in a face that wasn't quite there. It reached out with claws of pure shadow, and Jorik simply faded, not killed, not torn apart, but drained of life until only a withered husk remained. Women and children fled toward the sacred grove, but the shadows were faster, flowing across the ground like spilled ink. Kael's heart seized as he spotted his younger sister Mira among the runners, her small legs pumping desperately as one of the creatures gained on her. He burst from the tree line with a wordless roar, but even as he ran, he knew he would be too late. The shadow thing reared above Mira, its claws extending. The air cracked like thunder. Light blazed across the village square as one of Zara's fire sticks spoke its deadly language. The creature shrieked and recoiled, its form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. Another crack, another flash, and the beast dissolved entirely. Zara stood in the doorway of the healing lodge, her strange clothes torn and bloodied, the fire stick steady in her hands. She moved with fluid precision, each shot finding its mark, driving the shadow creatures back. But Kael could see the strain on her face, the way her movements had grown slightly sluggish. Her wounds were far from healed. "The perimeter!" she shouted to him as he reached the village edge. "They're trying to surround us!" Kael didn't question how she knew his language now, didn't wonder at the tactical knowledge in her voice. He simply acted. Grabbing a burning brand from a collapsed hut, he raced toward the village's eastern approach, where more shadows were gathering like a living storm. The creatures recoiled from the flame, hissing in voices that sounded like wind through empty graves. Fire hurt them, he realized. Not killed them like Zara's weapons, but it gave them pause. Behind him, the stranger's fire stick spoke again and again, each shot precise and deadly. She was buying them time, but at what cost? He could see her swaying now, her left arm hanging useless at her side. Elder Thane's voice rose above the chaos, chanting in the old tongue, calling upon ancestors and spirits for aid. But the ancient words seemed hollow against these creatures from nightmare. Kael felt something break inside him, not his courage, but his certainty. The old ways, the sacred traditions, the wisdom of the ancestors, none of it mattered against this enemy. Only Zara's impossible knowledge stood between his people and annihilation. Another shadow creature lunged at him. Kael thrust the torch forward, and the thing recoiled with a shriek that sounded almost like laughter. In that sound, he heard the echo of his own mortality, the fragility of everything he had ever believed. The choice was no longer abstract. It was here, now, written in smoke and shadow and the desperate cries of his dying people. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping spirits as Kael led a hunting party toward the eastern ridge. 3 days had passed since the council meeting, and the tribe's unease had settled into their bones like winter cold. Half the hunters avoided his gaze, while others watched him with a mixture of curiosity and fear that made his skin crawl. Behind him, young Tam stumbled over a root, his spear clattering against stone. The boy had been eager to join this hunt, desperate to prove himself worthy of the knowledge Kael had promised to share. But eagerness without skill would get them all killed. "Focus," Kael whispered harshly. "The forest doesn't care about your excitement." Tam's face flushed red, but he nodded and adjusted his grip on the spear. The other hunters, Jorik, Voss, and 2 younger men, exchanged glances that Kael pretended not to notice. They were here not just for game, but to watch him, to see if Naya's influence had somehow corrupted their best tracker. The thought made him bitter. 3 days ago, they would have followed him into the deepest caves without question. Now they jumped at every shadow, wondering if he might lead them into some alien trap. A branch snapped somewhere ahead, too deliberate to be natural. Kael raised his fist, and the party froze. He closed his eyes, letting his senses expand the way his father had taught him, the way generations of hunters had learned to read the forest's moods. There, the musty scent of cave bear, heavy and wild, but underneath it, something else, something wrong. The bear emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees, and Kael's blood turned to ice. The creature stood nearly twice the height of a man, its dark fur matted with strange, luminescent patches that pulsed with sickly green light. Where its left eye should have been, a cluster of crystal-like growths jutted from the socket, and similar formations erupted from its shoulders and flanks. Tam gasped and took a step backward. The sound was soft, but the corrupted bear's remaining eye snapped toward them with unnatural intelligence. When it opened its mouth to roar, more of the crystal growths gleamed from inside its throat. The blight, Jorik breathed. It's real. Kael felt the world tilt around him. Naya had warned him about this, the spreading corruption that followed her people's technology like a plague. She had tried to explain it in words he could barely understand, something about dimensional rifts and quantum contamination. All he knew was that it turned living things into abominations. The bear charged. "Scatter!" Kael shouted, but it was too late. The creature moved with impossible speed, its crystallized claws leaving gouges in the earth. Voss tried to dodge left, but one massive paw caught him across the chest. The impact sent him flying into a tree trunk with a sound like breaking branches. Kael's spear flew true, sinking deep into the bear's flank, but the creature barely noticed. The crystal growths seemed to pulse brighter, as if feeding on its pain. Jorik and the other hunters circled, their weapons ready, but Kael could see the terror in their eyes. This was beyond their understanding, beyond their ability to fight. The bear swiped at Tam, who rolled desperately away. Kael saw his chance and lunged forward, grabbing his spear and driving it deeper. The bear whirled, faster than anything that size should move, and backhanded him across the clearing. He hit the ground hard, tasting blood. Through blurred vision, he watched the creature advance on Tam, who had lost his weapon in the scramble. The boy's face was white with terror, but he stood his ground, hands raised in a futile gesture of defense. Something cold and metallic pressed into Kael's palm. He looked down to see one of Naya's devices. She must have slipped it to him during one of their conversations. A smooth cylinder no longer than his finger, with strange markings that seemed to shift in the light. He remembered her words, only in the direst need, and only once. The bear reared up on its hind legs, preparing to crush Tam beneath its weight. Kael squeezed the device. Light erupted from the cylinder, not the warm yellow of fire, but something colder and infinitely more intense. It struck the corrupted bear in the center of its chest, and the creature simply stopped. For a moment it hung frozen in the air, every crystal growth blazing like a tiny star. Then it collapsed, the light fading from its eyes and the growths crumbling to ash. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by Voss's labored breathing and the whisper of settling dust. The other hunters stared at Kael with expressions of awe and horror. In his hand, the device had gone dark and cold, useless as any other piece of metal. "Kael," Tam whispered, "what was that thing?" Kael looked at the bear's corpse, then at the faces of his companions. They would have questions he couldn't answer, suspicions he couldn't quiet. Word would spread through the tribe like wildfire. The choice he had been avoiding was no longer his to make. The blight had found them, and with it, the future Naya had warned him about. Whether he wanted it or not, change was coming to his people. The only question now was whether they would survive it. The council fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the weathered faces gathered in the sacred circle. Kael sat rigid beside Elder Thane, acutely aware of every whispered conversation, every suspicious glance directed toward the cave where Zara remained hidden. The weight of his deception pressed down like stones in his chest. "The spirits grow restless," muttered Vex, the tribe's spiritual guide, her milky eyes reflecting the dying flames. "I have seen omens in the smoke, dark wings circling, bringing change that will devour the old ways." Elder Thane nodded gravely. "The hunting has been poor these past moons. The herds move strangely, as if fleeing something beyond the horizon. Perhaps we should consider moving deeper into the protected lands." Kael's blood chilled. If the tribe relocated to the inner territories, there would be no way to conceal Zara's presence. The elders would perform the cleansing rituals, searching every cave and crevice for evil spirits. His secret would be exposed within days. "The protected lands are sacred ground," spoke Jorik, Kael's rival in many things. "We cannot simply abandon our ancestral hunting grounds because of superstition and poor luck." "Poor luck?" Vex's voice cracked like breaking ice. "You speak of things beyond your understanding, young hunter. I have walked between worlds for 40 seasons. What approaches is no mere change of fortune. As the debate continued, Kael noticed movement at the edge of the firelight. His brother Tam emerged from the shadows, his face grim with news. The sight made Kael's stomach clench with dread. "Forgive the interruption, elders," Tam said, bowing respectfully. "I bring word from the southern watchers. Strange lights have been seen in the sky, moving against the wind. They pulse like heartbeats and leave trails of silver fire." The council fell silent. Even the crackling flames seemed to quiet, as if the fire itself strained to hear. Elder Thane's weathered hands gripped his staff. How many lights? What direction did they travel? 7, maybe 8. They moved toward the forbidden peaks, then vanished as suddenly as they appeared. The watchers say the very air hummed with power. Kael fought to keep his expression neutral, but his mind raced. Zara had spoken of others like herself, scattered across the world. Could these lights be connected to her people? Were they searching for her, or were they something else entirely? Vex rose unsteadily, her ancient bones creaking like old leather. The prophecies speak of fire-bringers who fall from the sky realm. Their coming marks the end of one age and the birth of another. We stand at the threshold of transformation, whether we will it or not. Prophecies and legends, Jorik scoffed, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. We are hunters and gatherers, not children to be frightened by stories. The old woman's blind gaze turned toward him with unsettling precision. Stories carry truth, young fool. The ancestors embedded wisdom in every tale, every ritual, every sacred law. Ignore them at your peril. Elder Thane stood slowly, his authority settling over the gathering like a heavy cloak. We will increase the watches, double the guard rotations. If these strange lights return, I want immediate word. Until we understand what we face, the tribe remains here. Relief flooded through Kael, though he kept his gratitude hidden. At least they wouldn't be moving immediately. That bought him time, though for what purpose he wasn't entirely certain. As the council began to disperse, Tam approached his brother with obvious concern. You've been distant lately, Kael. Ever since your return from the deep hunt. Is something troubling you? The genuine worry in his brother's voice cut deep. Tam had always been his closest confidant, the one person who could read his moods like weather signs. Now Kael found himself building walls between them, and the isolation felt like a slow poison. The failed hunt weighs on me, Kael said, which was partially true. I keep wondering what I missed, what signs I failed to read. Tam clasped his shoulder. One poor hunt doesn't make you less of a tracker. The elders speak truly. Something has changed in the land. The animals sense it, even if we don't understand it yet. If only you knew, Kael thought bitterly. If only I could tell you about the woman who claims our world is dying, who speaks of machines in the sky and knowledge beyond imagining. Walk with me to the watchpost, Tam suggested. The night air might clear your thoughts. Kael almost agreed, then remembered the supplies he needed to gather for Zara. Her strange device had indicated her injuries were healing, but she still required regular sustenance and clean water. Another time, brother. I'm tired, and dawn comes early. As his brother disappeared into the darkness, Kael felt the weight of prophecy and deception settling around him like gathering storm clouds. Change was coming whether the tribe accepted it or not. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping spirits, as Kael led the hunting party through terrain that had become foreign to him overnight. Every familiar landmark now seemed to mock his certainty. The twisted oak where his father had taught him to track deer stood silent, its gnarled branches reaching toward a sky that suddenly felt too vast, too empty. Behind him, 6 of the tribe's finest hunters moved with practiced silence, their bone-tipped spears catching the early light. They trusted him completely, as they always had. The weight of that trust pressed against his chest like a stone. Jorik moved beside him, close enough that Kael could smell the pine smoke that always clung to his friend's clothing. You've been different since you brought back the stranger, Jorik whispered, his words barely audible above the soft rustle of their passage through the undergrowth. The elders notice everything, you know. Kael's hand tightened on his spear shaft. 3 days had passed since Lyra had spoken those impossible words about the dying sky, about metal birds that would bring death from above. 3 nights he had lain awake, staring at stars that now seemed like the eyes of watching predators rather than the gentle guardians of his childhood stories. "The stranger speaks truth," Kael said finally, the words feeling like betrayal even as he spoke them. "I've seen things, Jorik, signs in the forest that match her warnings." Jorik stopped walking. The other hunters, sensing the change in rhythm, halted as well, their eyes scanning the forest for whatever had caused the pause. But the danger they watched for moved on legs and claws, not on wings of metal death. "You sound like you believe her madness." Jorik's voice carried a sharp edge that cut through the morning calm. "The Council of Elders spent half the night discussing whether she's brought some curse upon us. Old Theron thinks we should have left her for the wolves." The mention of the wolves sent an involuntary shiver through Kael. 2 days ago, he had found their tracks near the eastern boundary, but not the familiar paw prints he knew from seasons of hunting. These were different, somehow wrong, as if the very wolves were changing, becoming something else. He had said nothing to the others, but Lyra's words echoed in his mind. "Everything will change, whether you're ready or not." A branch snapped somewhere ahead, and the hunting party immediately fell into formation. Kael raised his hand, signaling for silence, and they moved forward as one organism, 6 minds thinking with a single purpose. This was what he understood, what made sense. The hunt, the ancient dance between predator and prey that had sustained his people since the first fires were lit in the sacred caves. Through a gap in the trees, Kael glimpsed their quarry, a massive elk, its antlers spanning wider than a man could reach. The beast stood at the edge of a clearing, head raised, testing the wind with the same wariness that had kept its kind alive for countless generations. It was perfect, exactly what they needed to feed the tribe through the coming week. But as Kael notched his spear in the throwing position, movement in the sky above caught his eye. A bird, flying too straight, too purposeful. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, his breath caught. Then the bird banked slightly, revealing the familiar silhouette of a hunting hawk, and the moment shattered like ice in spring sun. Just a bird, nothing more. Yet his hands trembled as he sighted along the spear shaft. Lyra's voice whispered in his memory, "When they come, they'll come from the sky, and your spears won't reach high enough to save you." The elk sensed something wrong and began to move, stepping delicately toward the tree line. In seconds it would be gone, vanished into the deep forest, where even the best hunters could lose a trail. The moment of the hunt balanced on a knife's edge. Kael drew back his arm, feeling the familiar tension in his shoulders, the way his entire body aligned itself with the weapon's trajectory. This was who he was. This was what he knew. He released. The spear flew true, catching the elk behind the front shoulder in a throw that would feed his people and honor the ancient compact between hunter and hunted. The beast stumbled, then fell, its life flowing out onto ground that had witnessed this same scene 1,000 times before. The hunting party erupted in quiet celebration, moving efficiently to claim their prize. But as Kael knelt beside the fallen elk, performing the ritual words of thanks that his grandfather had taught him, his eyes kept drifting skyward. The hawk still circled overhead, riding the morning thermals with effortless grace, watching, waiting. And in its patient circuits, Kael saw the shape of a question that would not let him rest. How do you honor the old ways when the world itself is about to end? The first tremor struck just before dawn, a subtle vibration through the earth that made sleeping animals stir restlessly. Kael felt it in his bones, a wrongness that pulled him from uneasy dreams. He rolled from his sleeping furs to find Zara already awake, her face pale in the dim light filtering through their shelter's entrance. "It's beginning," she whispered, her enhanced senses detecting frequencies beyond human perception. "The seismic cascade I warned you about. We have perhaps 2 days before the major shifts start." Outside, the village was stirring with confused murmurs. Few had felt the tremor consciously, but something primal had awakened in them all. Kael watched as his people emerged from their dwellings, looking around with the wariness of prey animals sensing an approaching predator they couldn't yet see. Elder Thane appeared at the shelter's entrance, his weathered face grave. "The spirits are restless tonight, young hunter. Your friend's presence continues to disturb the natural order." "The natural order is about to kill you all," Zara said, struggling to sit upright despite her still healing injuries. That tremor was just the beginning. The volcanic system beneath the eastern mountains is destabilizing. When it erupts, the ash clouds alone will block out the sun for months. Your people will starve long before the climate recovers. Thane's eyes narrowed. More prophecies of doom from the sky-touched stranger? Our ancestors survived the great winter of legend. We will endure whatever the spirits send. Kael felt torn between two worlds as another, stronger tremor rolled beneath them. Around the village, children began to cry, and the hunting dogs whined uneasily. The evidence of Zara's warnings was literally shaking the ground beneath their feet, yet Thane's skepticism reflected the deep-rooted beliefs of their entire people. "Show him," Kael said quietly to Zara. "Show him what you showed me." Zara hesitated, then reached into her salvaged equipment pack. The small device she withdrew looked impossibly delicate, its smooth surfaces reflecting the firelight like captured starlight. When she activated it, a three-dimensional image materialized in the air between them, a perfect representation of their mountain range, complete with the underground magma chambers that fed the volcanic peaks. Thane stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for the bone amulets at his throat. "Demon magic," he breathed. "Not magic," Zara said patiently. "Technology, knowledge accumulated over thousands of years by people who learned to read the Earth's secrets." She gestured, and the image shifted, showing the stress patterns building beneath the mountains. Red zones pulsed ominously where the rock was reaching its breaking point. "See how the pressure has been building? Your legends speak of the Great Winter. That was the last time this happened, roughly 800 years ago. But this time will be worse." The holographic display zoomed in, revealing a massive magma chamber that had been growing for centuries. As they watched, simulated shockwaves rippled outward from a central point, showing how the coming eruption would trigger a chain reaction across multiple peaks. "The signs are all there," Zara continued. "The unusual animal behavior your hunters have reported, the changes in the hot springs temperature, the increased frequency of minor earthquakes. Your own people have been documenting the warnings without realizing it." Kael studied the elder's face, watching doubt war with stubborn tradition. "Thane, you taught me to read the signs of weather, of animal movements, of seasonal changes. This is the same skill, just bigger." A third tremor, stronger than the others, made the ground shift noticeably beneath their feet. Somewhere in the distance, they heard the crash of falling rocks. The holographic display flickered as Zara's device automatically updated its readings, showing new stress fractures appearing in real time. 2 days, she repeated urgently, maybe less. Your people need to move to higher ground, away from the eastern slopes, and they need to start gathering food, anything that can be preserved. The ashfall will contaminate water sources and kill plant life for hundreds of miles. Thane stared at the shifting image, his lifetime of accumulated wisdom warring with generations of inherited beliefs. If what you show us is true, where would we go? This valley has been our home since the first memories. Our ancestors' spirits dwell here. Your ancestors' spirits want their descendants to survive, Kael said firmly. That's why they preserved the stories of the last great winter, not as entertainment, but as warnings. The elder was quiet for a long moment, watching the ominous red zones pulse in the hologram. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man making an impossible choice. If we move the tribe, if we abandon everything on the word of a stranger with unnatural knowledge, and if you are wrong, then your people will have spent a few uncomfortable weeks camping in the highlands, Zara said. But if I'm right and you do nothing, there won't be anyone left to regret the decision. Another tremor shook the shelter, longer and stronger than the others, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the village, they heard the first distant rumble of shifting stone. The ground beneath Kael's feet trembled with each step of the approaching machines. Through the canopy above, metallic gleams caught the dying light as the sky hunters descended like predatory birds made of star metal. His tribe huddled behind the natural rock formations that had sheltered their ancestors for countless generations. But Kael knew these ancient stones would offer no protection against weapons that could tear the very air apart. Zara crouched beside him, her wounded shoulder bound with strips of hide, her strange device clutched in her remaining good hand. The object pulsed with a sickly blue light that made the nearby plants wither at their edges. She had warned him this moment would come, but witnessing the reality of her world descending upon his people filled him with a terror deeper than facing any dire wolf or storm giant. "How many?" he whispered, watching the shadows of her kin grow larger against the forest floor. 12 hunters, 2 command units, she replied, without looking at her device. "They've been tracking my biosignature since the crash. I should have died in that wreckage, Kael. Every moment I've lived has brought this closer to your people." Elder Thane crawled through the undergrowth toward them, his weathered face grim with understanding. The old man had argued against sheltering the Sky Woman, had spoken of the old warnings about those who fell from the star paths. Now his ancient eyes held no accusation, only a terrible acceptance. "The young ones?" Kael asked. Hidden in the deep caves with Mira and the others, Thane replied, "If we can hold them here, the children might survive long enough to flee to the eastern valleys." Zara's hand found Kael's arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite her injuries. "There's another way. My people come for me, but they also come because they fear what I might have told you. Knowledge is the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy, and they believe I've given you too much." The first of the sky hunters broke through the canopy with a sound like tearing thunder. Its hull gleamed with an oily iridescence, and Kael could see the silhouettes of armed figures within its transparent sections. The craft settled on 4 legs that carved furrows in the earth, and armed figures in clothing that shifted color like water began to emerge. "Zara 779, a voice called out, speaking her language but somehow making the words carry across the clearing. "You have violated the non-interference directive. Surrender yourself and submit to memory cleansing." She stood slowly, using Kael's shoulder for support. When she replied, she spoke in his people's tongue so all could understand. "I claim sanctuary among the Kethmori. These people have offered me protection according to their ancient laws." The lead figure removed its shifting helmet, revealing features similar to Zara's but harder, more angular. "You have contaminated a developing species with advanced knowledge. The penalty is dissolution of both the source and all contaminated elements." Kael's blood turned to ice water. They meant to kill not just Zara, but everyone who had spoken with her. Everyone who had heard her words about other worlds, other possibilities, his entire tribe. "Then you'll have to dissolve me first," Kael said, stepping forward with his spear raised. The weapon felt pathetically primitive in his hands, but it was all he had. The leader's expression didn't change, but other figures raised devices that hummed with contained energy. "Stand aside, primitive. This matter does not concern your kind." "Everything about this concerns my kind," Kael replied. "You speak of contamination, but I see only fear. You fear what might happen if people like us learn we're not alone. You fear what we might become." Thane moved to stand beside him, then others of his tribe emerged from concealment. They came forward with stone axes and bone knives, facing weapons that could unmake them with a thought. But they came nonetheless, because this was their land, their choice, their right to make. Zara's device suddenly flared brighter, and she grimaced with pain as she manipulated its surface. "The containment protocols are already breaking down across 7 sectors, she announced to her people. "Other observers have made contact. The isolation period is ending whether the council approves or not." The leader's face darkened. "All the more reason to maintain what boundaries remain. All the more reason to help them prepare for what's coming," Zara countered. "Look at them. They stand before weapons that could erase them, and they don't retreat. That's not contamination speaking. That's courage." Above them, More sky hunters circled like metal vultures. Kael counted at least 20 now, enough to scour every living thing from this entire valley. But as he looked at his people standing ready to die, rather than abandon their guest, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about choosing between old ways and new knowledge anymore. This was about choosing what kind of people they would be when the stars finally came calling. The weapons began to charge with a sound like screaming wind. The ground beneath Kael's feet trembled with a rhythm that spoke of massive machinery awakening deep within the earth. Behind him, the village erupted in panicked shouts as families gathered their children and elders, some fleeing toward the forest while others stood frozen in terror. The stranger, Zara, pressed her palm against a smooth section of the ancient stone pillar, and symbols blazed to life across its surface like captured starlight. "The defense grid is responding to the proximity alarms," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "But it's been dormant for so long, I'm not sure all systems will function properly." Elder Thane hobbled forward, his weathered face a mask of awe and fear. "The old song spoke truth," he whispered. "The stones do remember." Kael watched in fascination as more pillars throughout the valley began to glow, creating a network of light that pulsed in synchronized waves. The trembling grew stronger, and somewhere in the distance he heard the sound of stone grinding against stone. Ancient mechanisms buried for countless generations were stirring to life. "What exactly are we defending against?" Kael asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Zara's expression darkened as she worked at the pillar's interface. The Devourers, their biomechanical constructs designed for one purpose: to consume and convert organic matter into raw materials for their creator's expansion. They were what destroyed my people's civilization, and now they've found this world. A new sound reached them from beyond the forest, a low, thrumming hum that seemed to vibrate in Kael's bones. Through the canopy, he glimpsed flashes of metallic surfaces moving between the trees, too large and too wrong to be any creature he knew. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Minutes, maybe less." Zara's hands flew over the glowing symbols, her face illuminated by their ethereal light. "The defense network should create a barrier around the valley, but I need to calibrate it properly or it might not hold." Mira appeared at Kael's shoulder, her hunting bow drawn and ready. "The scouts report at least a dozen of them approaching from the north. They're unlike anything we've ever seen, tall as trees, with limbs that shift and change as they move." Kael felt the weight of leadership settle on his shoulders like a mantle of stone. His people looked to him for guidance, but what wisdom could a hunter offer against machines from the stars? He thought of his father's teachings about reading the signs in nature, about understanding the balance between predator and prey. Perhaps some truths remained constant, even in this impossible situation. "Mira, organize the hunters. Position them behind the stone circle, but keep clear of the pillars. If these defenses fail, we'll need to buy time for the families to escape." He turned to Elder Thane. "Can you help Zara? The old songs might contain knowledge we need." The elder nodded solemnly and moved closer to the pillar, studying the flowing symbols with ancient eyes. "The patterns. Yes, I remember fragments. This symbol here, it speaks of barriers, of holding back the darkness." The first of the Devourers emerged from the forest just as a dome of shimmering energy began to form overhead. The creature was a nightmare fusion of metal and flesh, standing twice the height of a man with multiple arms that ended in cutting tools and energy projectors. Its surface rippled and shifted as internal mechanisms reconfigured its form for maximum efficiency. It struck the energy barrier with a sound like thunder, and the entire dome flickered dangerously. More Devourers joined it, pressing against the shield with relentless pressure. Sparks of displaced energy rained down like falling stars. "The barrier's holding, but barely," Zara reported, sweat beading on her forehead from the effort of maintaining the connection. "The power cells are ancient. They won't sustain this level of output for long." Kael watched the creatures probe the barrier, testing it methodically for weaknesses. Their intelligence was alien but undeniable, cold and calculating in a way that made his skin crawl. These were not mere beasts driven by hunger, but instruments of annihilation following their programmed directive with perfect efficiency. There, Elder Thane pointed to a cluster of symbols near the base of the pillar. The song of the deep paths. It speaks of hidden ways, of power that flows beneath the earth. Zara's eyes widened as she followed his indication. The geothermal taps. If I can reroute power from the primary core... Her fingers traced new patterns, and the barrier's flickering steadied. But even as it strengthened, more devourers emerged from the forest, a seemingly endless procession of death machines converging on their small sanctuary. "How many more are there?" Mira asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Too many," Zara replied grimly. "This is just the first wave. They'll keep coming until they've consumed everything." Kael gripped his spear tighter, knowing that steel would be useless against such foes. Yet he stood ready, as his ancestors had stood ready against every threat that had ever menaced their people. Some things were worth defending, even unto death. The ground trembled beneath Kael's feet as the ancient machines awakened from their millennia-long slumber. What had begun as distant humming now crescendoed into a thunderous roar that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. Through the crystalline chamber's transparent walls, he could see massive structures rising from hidden depths, their surfaces gleaming with the same ethereal light that had drawn him to this place. Zara's fingers flew across the control interface, her movements precise despite the urgency etched across her face. "The planetary defense grid is coming online," she called over the mechanical symphony. "But something's wrong. The sequence is accelerating beyond normal parameters." Kael watched in stunned silence as holographic displays materialized around them, showing a three-dimensional map of their world. Countless points of light flickered to life across continents he'd never known existed, each pulse accompanied by tremors that shook dust from the chamber's ceiling. The scope of what lay hidden beneath their feet defied comprehension. "Your people," Kael said, his voice barely audible above the din. "They built all of this?" "Not just built," Zara replied, her hands never pausing in their work. "They designed it to be self-sustaining, to protect this world long after they were gone. But it was never meant to activate like this." Her expression darkened as streams of data flowed across the displays. "Something's corrupted the activation protocols." A new sound joined the mechanical chorus, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to reach into Kael's chest and squeeze. Through the chamber walls, he could see energy beginning to coalesce around the rising structures, forming patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. The very air seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. "Can you stop it?" Kael asked. Zara's silence was answer enough. Her shoulders tensed as she worked, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chamber's constant temperature. "The system's designed to resist tampering. It thinks it's protecting the planet from an invasion." She paused, her hands hovering over the interface. "Maybe it is." The implications hit Kael like a physical blow. If the defense grid activated fully, what would happen to his people, to the countless tribes scattered across the lands they'd called home for generations? Would the ancient machines see them as invaders to be eliminated? "There has to be a way," he said, moving closer to the interface. The symbols and patterns meant nothing to him, but he could see the desperation in Zara's movements. "You said your people left you as guardians. They must have left safeguards." "They did," Zara whispered, her voice nearly lost in the growing cacophony. "But the cost—" Before she could explain, the chamber shuddered violently. Through the walls, they could see one of the massive structures beginning to rotate, its surface panels sliding open to reveal weaponry that belonged in nightmares. Energy crackled between towering spires, building toward something that would reshape their world forever. Kael felt a familiar presence at the edge of his consciousness, the same sensation he'd experienced when first touching the crystal formations. But this time, it wasn't the gentle whisper of ancient wisdom. This was something vast and alien, an intelligence so far beyond human understanding that it threatened to overwhelm his mind entirely. "It's trying to communicate," he gasped, pressing his hands against his temples as alien thoughts crashed through his consciousness like a flood. Images flashed before his eyes, star-filled skies torn apart by impossible geometries, worlds consumed by entities that existed between dimensions, civilizations that had faced the same choice now confronting them. Zara spun around, her eyes wide with recognition. "You can hear it? The system's central intelligence?" Kael nodded, fighting to maintain his sense of self as the alien consciousness pressed against his mind. Through the connection, he could feel the machine's purpose, its desperate need to protect, to preserve, to ensure that what had happened to its creators would never happen again. But its definition of protection was absolute: eliminate all variables, sterilize all threats, preserve only what could be controlled. "It doesn't understand," he said through gritted teeth. "It sees us as contamination." The energy buildup reached a critical threshold. Through the chamber walls, they could see beams of light beginning to lance across the sky, probing the atmosphere with surgical precision. Where they touched the ground, vegetation withered and stone turned to glass. It was beautiful and terrible, a demonstration of power that dwarfed anything in Kael's experience. Zara's hands moved across the interface one final time, her expression grim with resolve. "There's one option left," she said. "But it requires a direct neural interface with the central intelligence. Someone has to convince it that humanity isn't the threat it believes us to be." She turned to face him, and Kael saw something in her eyes that chilled him more than the alien presence in his mind. "The process is irreversible. Whoever makes the connection becomes part of the system forever." The chamber continued to shake as more defensive systems came online, their combined power building toward a crescendo that would either save their world or destroy it entirely. The descent into the underground facility felt like entering the belly of some ancient metal beast. Emergency lighting cast eerie red shadows along corridors that stretched beyond sight, and their footsteps echoed with a hollow resonance that made Kael's skin crawl. The air tasted of rust and something else, something that reminded him of the moments before lightning strikes. "The main power core is 3 levels down," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant hum of machinery. "But the security systems will have activated by now. We won't have long." Behind them, Elder Thane moved with surprising agility for his age, his weathered hands gripping the pulse weapon Zara had given him. The other hunters spread out in formation, their primitive spears looking almost comical next to the sleek walls covered in blinking lights and incomprehensible symbols. "I still don't understand how destroying this place will stop the Devourers," Jorik muttered, his usual bravado replaced by nervous energy. "Because this isn't just a research station," Zara replied, leading them past a series of sealed chambers. Through the transparent walls, Kael glimpsed shapes floating in murky fluid, things that might have once been human but were twisted into something else entirely. "It's a beacon. Every experiment, every test subject, every horror they've created here sends out a signal that draws the Devourers closer." Kael forced himself to look away from the chambers. "And you knew this, all this time?" "I suspected. The fragment of memory I recovered showed me pieces, but I couldn't be certain until we arrived." Zara stopped at a junction where 3 corridors met. The scientists here were trying to replicate Devourer technology, to understand how they consume consciousness itself. But they didn't realize that their research was being monitored. A low alarm began to pulse through the facility, and the red lights shifted to a more urgent amber. Somewhere in the distance, Kael heard the mechanical whir of movement, something large and purposeful. "Security drones," Zara said grimly. "This way, quickly." They plunged down a maintenance shaft, the metal rungs cold against Kael's palms. The hunters moved with the fluid grace of men accustomed to navigating treacherous terrain, but this environment felt alien in ways that challenged every instinct they possessed. As they emerged into a vast chamber filled with towering cylindrical structures, Elder Thane spoke for the first time since entering the facility. "In all my years, I have seen the world change in small ways, seasons shifting, animals migrating new paths, the very stars seeming to move differently across the sky. But this," he gestured at the incomprehensible technology surrounding them, "this is change that devours itself." "The old man's wiser than I gave him credit for," Zara said, checking readings on a device pulled from her pack. "These are quantum processors. Each one contains the consciousness patterns of thousands of beings. The devourers aren't just random predators, they're farmers, and we're their crop." The weight of this revelation settled over the group like a physical force. Kael found himself thinking of his village, of Naya's worried face as they departed, of children playing games that suddenly seemed heartbreakingly precious. "How long do we have?" he asked. "The beacon's signal intensifies with each completed experiment. Based on the quantum resonance patterns," Zara paused, her expression growing pale. "Hours, maybe less." A new sound joined the alarm, the distinctive whine of energy weapons charging. From the upper galleries of the chamber, sleek metallic shapes descended on nearly silent repulsors. The security drones were elegant in their lethality, their sensors painting the hunters with targeting beams. "Spread out!" Kael shouted, falling back on hunting instincts as the first energy blasts seared the air where they'd been standing. The hunters scattered with practiced efficiency, using the massive quantum processors as cover. Jorik's spear, enhanced with salvage technology, crackled with electricity as he hurled it at the nearest drone. The weapon found its mark, sending the machine spinning into a processor bank in a shower of sparks. Elder Thane moved with fluid precision, his pulse weapon speaking in sharp bursts that dropped 2 more drones. "These machines fight without spirit," he called out. "They can be beaten." But more drones were emerging from hidden alcoves, and Kael could see that they were adapting to the hunters' tactics with each exchange. Worse, the constant weapons fire was damaging the quantum processors, and each breach sent waves of agonizing psychic feedback through the chamber. "The power core!" Zara shouted over the chaos. "It's through that blast door!" Kael saw where she pointed, a reinforced barrier marked with warning symbols in a dozen languages. But between them and their destination, at least 20 drones maintained a withering crossfire. As another wave of psychic feedback washed over them, Kael felt something else, a presence at the edge of perception, vast and hungry and drawing closer with each passing moment. The devourers had sensed the disturbance. Time was running out, and they were still 3 levels away from their objective. The settlement stirred to life as dawn broke over the eastern hills, but Kael noticed the changes immediately. Where once his people had moved with the unhurried rhythm of countless generations, now there was urgency in their steps. Children, who should have been learning to track deer, were instead gathered around makeshift tables, struggling to understand the strange symbols Lyra called numbers. Elders who had spent lifetimes perfecting the art of flint knapping now fumbled with metal tools scavenged from the crashed vessel. Kael watched from the edge of the clearing as his sister Nara attempted to explain something called cultivation to a group of confused hunters. Her voice carried the same fervor that had once belonged to Thane's sermons about honoring the old ways, but now she spoke of soil nutrients and crop rotation with religious intensity. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Regret is written across your face like war paint," Lyra said, appearing beside him with that uncanny ability she had to move silently despite her still healing injuries. "My people are abandoning everything that made them who they are," Kael replied, not taking his eyes off the scene before them. "Yesterday they were hunters, gatherers, children of the forest. Today they try to become something else entirely." Lyra followed his gaze to where several young men were arguing over the proper way to construct what she had called a greenhouse. Their voices rose in frustration as the foreign concepts clashed with everything they understood about the natural world. "Change is never clean," she said softly. "But look closer. Your sister isn't just teaching them about plants. She's adapting my knowledge to work with your existing understanding of the forest. That's wisdom, not abandonment." Before Kael could respond, a commotion erupted from the northern edge of the settlement. Jorik came running through the trees, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Riders approaching, he gasped, doubling over to catch his breath, many of them armed. The peaceful morning shattered like thin ice. Women gathered children while men reached for spears and bows. Kael felt his heart sink as he recognized the organized response Lyra's tactical training had taught them. Even their fear had been militarized. "How many?" he asked Jorik. 20, maybe more. "They carry the red banners of the river clans." Lyra's expression darkened. "The radiation readings from their territory have been climbing. If their water sources are contaminated, they'll be looking for new lands, violently if necessary." Kael was already moving toward the center of the settlement, his mind racing. The river clans were known for their aggression, their willingness to take what they needed regardless of cost. Under normal circumstances, his people would have melted into the forest, avoiding confrontation through cunning and knowledge of hidden paths. But now they had infrastructure to protect, crops that couldn't be moved, and a wounded stranger whose knowledge made her too valuable to risk in flight. "Form defensive positions," he called out, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. His father had never given such orders. His grandfather had never needed to. But Thane was gone, and the old ways of avoidance seemed suddenly inadequate. The riders emerged from the tree line like storm clouds made flesh. Their leader, a scarred woman with ritual burns covering her arms, surveyed the settlement with calculating eyes. Kael could see her taking note of the strange structures, the metal implements scattered about, the obvious signs that this was no ordinary hunting camp. "I am Vex of the River Clans," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Our lands have become unsuitable. We require new territory." "These lands are claimed," Kael replied, stepping forward despite the tremor in his voice, "by ancient right and blood bond." Vex laughed, a sound like breaking stone. "Ancient right?" She gestured at the greenhouse frame, at the solar collectors Lyra had helped them construct. "You speak of tradition while embracing foreign magic. Your own ancestors would spit on this corruption." The accusation hit home because it carried truth. Kael felt the weight of watching eyes, his people waiting to see how he would respond, Lyra observing how he would balance old wisdom with new necessity. "We adapt to survive," he said finally, "as all life must. Then adapt to this." Vex raised her hand, and her warriors readied their weapons. "Abandon this place within the day, or we will take it by force. Your new magic tricks won't stand against River Clan steel." As the riders wheeled about and departed, leaving their ultimatum hanging in the air like smoke, Kael realized that all their philosophical debates about change and tradition had become irrelevant. In less than 24 hours, they would face their first true test of whether Lyra's knowledge could preserve, not just their way of life, but their lives themselves. The morning sun climbed higher, but its warmth couldn't dispel the chill that had settled over the settlement like a burial shroud. The ground beneath Kael's feet trembled as the ancient machinery deep within the mountain roared to life. Crystalline panels that had remained dark for centuries now pulsed with ethereal blue light, casting dancing shadows across the cavern walls. Beside him, Zara's fingers moved across the control surface with practiced precision, her face pale but determined. "The defensive grid is responding," she said, her voice barely audible above the growing hum of awakening technology. "But I don't know how long the power cells will hold. They've been dormant for so long." Through the cavern's entrance, Kael could see his tribe gathered in the valley below, their faces turned upward in a mixture of terror and wonder. The children pressed close to their mothers while the warriors stood with spears raised, as if primitive weapons could somehow protect them from the forces now stirring in their sacred mountain. Elder Thorn stood apart from the others, his weathered face a mask of betrayal and fury. Even from this distance, Kael could feel the weight of his grandfather's condemnation. The old man had devoted his life to preserving their traditions, and now those very traditions lay shattered at Kael's feet. "They're coming," Zara announced, studying the flickering displays that showed the approach of the Dominion fleet. Hundreds of vessels moved through the upper atmosphere like a swarm of metallic insects, their weapons already charging for orbital bombardment. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before they're in position." Kael's hands shook as he pressed them against the warm crystal surface Zara had shown him. The moment his skin made contact, images flooded his mind, not memories of his own life, but inherited knowledge passed down through generations in his very blood. He saw the mountain as it once was, a fortress of gleaming metal and impossible geometries, home to people who looked remarkably like his own tribe, but dressed in clothing that seemed woven from starlight itself. "I can feel them," he whispered, overwhelmed by the connection. "My ancestors, they're still here somehow, in the mountain's memory." Zara nodded grimly. "The neural network preserves consciousness patterns of all who've bonded with it. Your people have been guardians of this technology far longer than they remember. The stories your elders tell of spirits in the mountain, they're not superstition, they're truth, filtered through centuries of oral tradition. The first energy blast struck the mountain's exterior, but instead of searing stone and earth, it dissipated against an invisible barrier that shimmered into visibility upon impact. The defensive shields that had once protected an interstellar civilization still functioned, though Kael could sense their strain through his neural link. "Warning systems show multiple breaches in the lower sectors," Zara called out, her attention split between the displays and the approaching threat. "They're not just bombing us, they're sending ground forces into the old mining tunnels. They want the technology intact." Kael closed his eyes and let his consciousness sink deeper into the mountain's network. He could feel every passage, every hidden chamber, every dormant system waiting for activation. But with that knowledge came a terrible understanding of the choice before him. "If we fully activate the defenses," he said slowly, "what happens to my people, to the tribe?" Zara's pause told him everything he needed to know. The neural integration required for full system control. "It changes you permanently. You'd become something more than human, but also something less. A guardian fused with the mountain's consciousness, protecting this place for eternity." Through the cavern entrance, Kael watched his childhood friend Naya shepherding the younger children to safety. He saw his cousin Jorik standing with the other hunters, their primitive weapons useless against the approaching threat, but their courage undiminished. These were his people, bound to him by blood and tradition and love. Another blast shook the mountain, stronger this time. The shields flickered ominously. "There might be another way," Zara said suddenly, her fingers dancing across the controls with renewed urgency. "If I interface directly with the core systems while you maintain the neural link, we might be able to create a feedback pulse. It would disable the Dominion fleet, but what? The energy discharge would be enormous. We'd have to channel it through our own neural patterns. Neither of us would survive." Kael looked out at his tribe one last time, seeing Elder Thorn's rigid disapproval, seeing Naya's worried face, seeing the children who represented their future. Behind him, ancient technology hummed with the promise of power enough to save them all, at the cost of everything he was. The Dominion ships moved into final attack formation, their weapons trained on the mountain that held the last remnants of a civilization they'd spent centuries trying to erase. In moments, they would fire with enough force to crack the mountain's heart and expose its secrets. Kael placed both hands on the neural interface and felt the full weight of his ancestors' legacy flowing through him. "Tell me what I need to do," he said.